"That woman has no business pretending she understands military sacrifice," Dr. Walsh muttered to his colleague as they watched the exhausted nurse working through her third consecutive shift. Sarah Martinez hadn't eaten in 6 hours, her scrubs were stained with blood from the morning's casualties, and her hands moved with the precision of someone who had seen trauma far beyond these hospital walls. But what nobody knew was the small tattoo hidden beneath her uniform, a Guardian Angel Medical Corps insignia that would soon make a visiting general stop dead in his tracks and salute a woman they all thought was just another overworked civilian nurse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Regional Medical Center cast their familiar harsh glow across the emergency department as Sarah Martinez pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail for the third time that morning. The rubber band was fraying, much like her patients after working what was supposed to be a 12-hour shift that had already stretched into its 18th hour. She caught her reflection in the polished steel of a supply cabinet door and saw what everyone else saw: a tired woman in her mid-30s, unremarkable scrubs, and the kind of exhaustion that came from being chronically understaffed and overworked. What they couldn't see was the way her eyes automatically swept every room for exits, how her hands moved with surgical precision even when bone-tired, or the small scar along her jawline that disappeared into her hairline. Most importantly, they couldn't see the tattoo that lay hidden beneath the cotton blend of her scrub top, positioned precisely over her left shoulder blade where it had rested for the past 5 years. Cedar Falls, Colorado wasn't supposed to be a high-trauma town. Nestled in the shadow of the Rockies, it was the kind of place where the biggest emergency was usually a skiing accident or a fender bender on the mountain highway. But proximity to Fort Mitchell Army Base meant that St. Mary's saw its share of military families, veterans struggling with injuries both visible and invisible, and the occasional overflow when the base hospital was at capacity. Sarah had specifically chosen this place for its quiet reputation. After what she'd experienced overseas, the idea of treating bee stings and broken arms in a small Colorado hospital had seemed like exactly the kind of peace she needed. What she hadn't anticipated was how the sight of young soldiers barely old enough to vote being wheeled in with training injuries would make her throat close up and her hands shake until she forced herself to breathe through the memories. The morning had started typically enough. A construction worker with a lacerated hand, an elderly woman with chest pains who turned out to have severe heartburn, and 2 teenagers who had gotten creative with fireworks despite it being nowhere near the 4th of July. Sarah moved between rooms with quiet efficiency, her bedside manner gentle but professional. She didn't engage in the small talk that filled the corridors, didn't join the gossip sessions in the break room, and certainly didn't participate in the ongoing speculation about her background that seemed to follow her wherever she worked. "Martinez is weird," she'd overheard nurse supervisor Linda Chen telling Dr. Amanda Foster near the medication lockup. "Been here 8 months, and nobody knows anything about her. No family photos, no stories about college, no dating drama. She just works and goes home. It's unnatural." Dr. Foster, fresh out of residency and still young enough to believe that medical training made her an expert on human nature, had nodded sagely. "Probably had some kind of breakdown. You see it sometimes with nurses who can't handle the pressure. They get all withdrawn and mysterious, like they're carrying some big secret." Sarah had continued checking inventory as if she hadn't heard them, but the familiar knot had formed in her stomach. It was always the same wherever she worked. People needed explanations for anyone who didn't fit their comfortable categories. They needed to know your story, your history, your motivation for choosing medicine. They couldn't simply accept that some people preferred to let their work speak for itself. The truth was, Sarah Martinez had stories that would make their comfortable assumptions crumble into dust. She had stories about holding pressure on wounds while mortars fell around her position. She had stories about improvised surgery in the back of a transport vehicle racing across desert terrain. She had stories about the weight of dog tags collected from friends who wouldn't be coming home and about the particular silence that fell over a field hospital when you lost someone you'd promised their mother you'd look after. But those weren't stories for hospital break rooms or casual conversations over coffee. Those were stories that belonged to a different person, a different life, a different version of herself that she'd carefully buried beneath 8 months of routine trauma care and the blessed anonymity of civilian nursing. Dr. Kevin Walsh, the emergency department's head physician, represented everything Sarah had learned to navigate carefully in civilian medicine. He was competent enough, she'd give him that, but his competence came wrapped in an arrogance that made every interaction feel like a test of his authority. He questioned her judgment on medication dosages, double-checked her patient assessments, and had a habit of explaining basic medical procedures to her as if she'd just graduated nursing school yesterday. Martinez, he'd called out earlier that week when she'd administered pain medication to a patient with obvious kidney stones. Next time, check with me before giving morphine. We need to be careful about drug-seeking behavior. Sarah had shown him the chart, the clear indicators of kidney stones on the imaging, the patient's history, and the standard protocol for pain management. Walsh had glanced at it dismissively and said, "Right, well, just remember that experience teaches you to spot these things. You'll develop better instincts with time." She hadn't bothered to mention that she'd probably administered more morphine in field conditions than he'd seen in his entire career. She hadn't explained that she could recognize drug-seeking behavior from across a room, or that her instincts had been honed in situations where the wrong call meant someone died. Instead, she'd simply nodded and continued her work, adding another small weight to the growing pile of condescension she carried everywhere she went. The irony wasn't lost on her. In the Army, her medical skills had been respected, valued, and desperately needed. She'd been part of a forward surgical team that had saved hundreds of lives, had earned commendations for her work under fire, and had been trusted with responsibilities that would have overwhelmed most civilian nurses. But here, without the context of her military service, she was just another nurse whose judgment needed constant supervision. It was approaching noon when the morning took an unexpected turn. Sarah was restocking supplies in Trauma Bay 3 when she heard the distinctive whine of helicopter rotors approaching the hospital's landing pad. Life flight wasn't uncommon, but something about the sound made her pause and listen. The pitch was different, more military than medical, and it triggered a response she'd thought she'd trained herself to suppress. Through the trauma bay's small window, she could see a Black Hawk helicopter settling onto the landing pad, its rotors whipping the late morning snow into swirling clouds. This wasn't a medical transport. The helicopter bore the insignia of Fort Mitchell, and as the rotors wound down, she could see figures in dress uniforms emerging from the aircraft. "What's all the excitement about?" Dr. Foster appeared beside her, craning her neck to see out the window. Linda Chen bustled into the trauma bay, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression she reserved for situations that required proper protocol. "We're having a special visitor today. General Thompson from Fort Mitchell is here for some kind of community outreach thing. Hospital administration wants everything perfect, so let's make sure we're all on our best behavior." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach at the mention of the name. Thompson. It couldn't be the same Thompson, could it? The odds were astronomical, but in her experience, the universe had a cruel sense of humor when it came to forcing confrontations with the past. "He's here for the Veterans Day ceremony they're planning," Chen continued, consulting her clipboard. "Apparently he lost his daughter in Afghanistan a few years back, and now he does these community events to honor military medical personnel." Very touching story, I'm sure. The cold feeling in Sarah's stomach became a full Arctic freeze. She knew exactly which Thompson this was now, and she knew exactly which daughter Linda Chen was talking about. Jessica Thompson, 26 years old, auburn hair that she kept in regulation but somehow always looked perfect. Laugh that could cut through the tension of a field hospital like a knife through butter. Hands that moved faster than anyone's when a casualty came in critical. Jessica Thompson, who had died in Sarah's arms on a dusty road outside Kandahar while Sarah pressed gauze against a wound that no amount of pressure could stop. "Martinez, you look like you've seen a ghost," Dr. Walsh's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Are you feeling all right?" Sarah forced herself to focus on his face, to push down the memories that were threatening to surface. "I'm fine, just tired. It's been a long shift." "Well, pull yourself together. We need everyone sharp today. This general is apparently a big deal, and the last thing we need is staff looking unprofessional when he tours the department." If only he knew, Sarah thought grimly. If only any of them knew that she'd probably spent more time with General Thompson's daughter than he had during Jessica's last 2 years of life. If only they knew that she'd written the letter that had never been sent, the one where she'd tried to explain to a father how his daughter had died and why Sarah had failed to save her. But they didn't know, and they wouldn't know, because Sarah Martinez had become an expert at burying the past so deep that even she sometimes forgot it was there. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation and nervous energy from the hospital staff. Administration personnel appeared and disappeared with fresh flowers and hastily printed signs. The public relations department materialized from whatever corner of the building they usually occupied, armed with cameras and talking points about the hospital's commitment to veteran care. Sarah tried to focus on her work, but every sound of military-issue boots in the corridor made her tense. She found herself checking and rechecking supply inventories, reorganizing medication carts, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. The tattoo on her shoulder blade felt like it was burning through her scrub top, as if the mere proximity of someone from her past was causing it to glow like a beacon. "You're being ridiculous," she told herself firmly as she counted gauze pads for the 3rd time. "There's no reason for him to even notice you, let alone recognize you. It's been 5 years, you're in civilian clothes, and you're just another face in a hospital full of staff." But even as she tried to rationalize away her anxiety, Sarah knew that some connections transcended time and circumstance. She and General Thompson were bound together by grief, by loss, by the weight of Jessica's memory. If there was any justice in the universe, they would pass each other like ships in the night, 2 people carrying the same burden but never having to acknowledge it. Unfortunately, Sarah had stopped believing in justice somewhere between her second tour and her medical discharge. The general's entourage finally appeared in the emergency department just after 2 in the afternoon. Sarah caught a glimpse of them through the glass partition of the supply room, where she'd strategically positioned herself. General Thompson was exactly as she remembered him from the photographs Jessica had shown her, tall and distinguished with prematurely gray hair, and the kind of bearing that came from decades of command responsibility. But there was something different about him now, a heaviness around his eyes that spoke of personal loss. He was accompanied by 2 junior officers, a hospital administrator who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and Dr. Walsh, who had clearly appointed himself as the general's personal guide to the wonders of civilian emergency medicine. "This is our main trauma bay," Walsh was saying in the voice he reserved for people he considered important. "We handle everything from routine emergencies to major trauma cases. Our staff is highly trained and experienced in dealing with all types of medical situations." Sarah watched through the glass as the general nodded politely, his attention focused on the equipment and layout rather than Walsh's commentary. His eyes were constantly moving, taking in details, assessing capabilities. It was the look of someone who had seen medical facilities in less than ideal conditions and knew what really mattered when lives were on the line. "We also provide care for veterans and military families from Fort Mitchell." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The administrator was saying, clearly reading from mental notes. "We understand the unique challenges that military personnel face, both in terms of physical injuries and psychological trauma." At this, the general's expression shifted slightly. Something flickered across his face, too quick for the others to catch but unmistakable to Sarah. It was the look of someone who had heard those words before, probably from dozens of well-meaning civilians who had no idea what they were actually talking about. "That's very commendable," the general replied diplomatically. "Supporting our service members and their families is crucial work." The group moved on to the next area, and Sarah allowed herself to breathe again. Maybe she'd been worrying for nothing. Maybe this would just be a standard hospital tour, some photo opportunities, and then the general would return to Fort Mitchell without ever knowing that Jessica Thompson's former partner was working just a few rooms away. That's when Trauma Bay 1's alarm started screaming. The alarm's shrill cry cut through the hospital's controlled chaos like a blade through silk. Sarah's body responded before her mind had fully processed the sound, muscle memory from countless emergencies taking over as she dropped the gauze she'd been counting and moved toward the trauma bay. Her exhaustion evaporated in an instant, replaced by the sharp focus that had kept her alive through 2 tours of duty. Multi-vehicle accident on Highway 285. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the intercom system. 3 vehicles involved. Estimated 4 casualties. 2 critical. ETA 12 minutes. Sarah was already moving, her hands automatically checking equipment locations and mentally cataloging what would be needed. Behind her, she could hear the hurried footsteps of other staff members responding to the call, but her world had narrowed to the familiar rhythm of trauma preparation. Check the monitors, ensure the crash cart was fully stocked, verify that the defibrillator was charged and ready. Dr. Walsh appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with the particular combination of excitement and anxiety that major trauma cases brought out in emergency physicians. Martinez, I need you in Trauma 2. We're expecting 2 critical patients, possible chest trauma and head injuries. Sarah nodded, her movements already shifting into the efficient, economical patterns that had served her well in field hospitals, where every second counted and every motion had to serve a purpose. She could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergency medicine, the heightened awareness that made colors seem brighter and sounds clearer. What she didn't notice was that the general's tour had been interrupted by the emergency, and that he and his entourage had moved to an observation area overlooking the trauma bays. General Thompson stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the controlled chaos of trauma preparation with the interest of someone who had seen similar scenes in very different circumstances. This is fascinating. Drive, Walsh was saying to the general, clearly pleased to have such an impressive audience for what was about to be a major case. You'll be able to see how we handle critical trauma here. Our staff is really quite skilled at this sort of thing. The general's response was non-committal, but his eyes were sharp as he watched the various staff members moving through their preparations. Sarah was dimly aware of the observation window above the trauma bay, but her attention was focused on more immediate concerns. The monitors were functioning properly, the IV bags were full, and the surgical instruments were laid out in the precise order that would allow for maximum efficiency. The first ambulance arrived with a sound that Sarah had learned to interpret like a language. The engine's urgency, the way the siren cut off abruptly, the speed at which the doors opened, all told her that this was indeed a critical case. The paramedics who wheeled in the first patient were moving with the kind of controlled haste that spoke of serious injuries. 23-year-old male, driver of the first vehicle, the lead paramedic reported, as they transferred the patient to the trauma bay bed. Significant chest trauma, possible pneumothorax, blood pressure dropping, pulse thready. He's been in and out of consciousness since we got him. Sarah's hands were already moving, connecting monitors, establishing IV access, her movements precise and economical. The patient was young, maybe a few years older than Jessica had been when she died, and something about his face triggered a memory that Sarah immediately pushed aside. This wasn't the time for personal recollections. Possible internal bleeding, she called out to Dr. Walsh, who was examining the patient's chest. His abdomen is rigid, and his pulse is getting weaker. Dr. Walsh nodded, his attention focused on the immediate crisis. Let's get him to surgery. Call the OR and tell them we're coming up. But as they prepared to move the patient, his condition deteriorated rapidly. The monitors began screaming warnings, his blood pressure dropped precipitously, and Sarah could see the telltale signs of someone who was slipping away. He's crashing, she called out, her voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. We need to intubate now, and we need to get that chest tube in immediately. This was the moment when Sarah's civilian facade began to crack. Under pressure, her military training took over. and she began moving with an efficiency and confidence that went far beyond what anyone expected from a hospital nurse. Her hands worked with surgical precision, her voice carried the authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under fire, and her whole demeanor shifted into something that had nothing to do with civilian medicine. Dr. Walsh was struggling with the intubation, his hands shaking slightly under the pressure. Sarah could see that he was about to lose the patient, and every instinct she had was screaming at her to take over. But she was a nurse, not a doctor, and there were protocols to follow, hierarchies to respect. "Doctor," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made Walsh look up at her. "Let me help." There was something in her tone, something that spoke of experience and competence, that made Walsh step aside without argument. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, securing the airway, getting the patient stabilized, working with a skill level that went far beyond what her civilian position should have given her. From the observation window above, General Thompson was watching intently. Something about the nurse's movements, the way she handled the emergency, the calm authority she displayed under pressure, had caught his attention. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused on Sarah's actions. "That nurse," he said quietly to the aide beside him, "she's had military training." The aide looked down at the trauma bay, then back at the general. "Sir?" "The way she moves, the way she handles the equipment, the way she took control of that situation, that's not civilian training. That's military medicine." Down in the trauma bay, Sarah was focused entirely on her patient. She had managed to stabilize him enough for transport to surgery, and as the OR team arrived to take over, she finally allowed herself to step back and assess the situation. The patient would live, at least for now, and that was what mattered. But as she stepped away from the bed, she became aware of the silence that had fallen over the trauma bay. Dr. Walsh was staring at her with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. The other nurses were looking at her with new interest, and she could feel the weight of attention from the observation window above. "Where did you learn to do that?" Dr. Walsh asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. Sarah felt her heart rate spike, not from the emergency, but from the realization that her cover was beginning to slip. "I've had some additional training," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice neutral. "What kind of additional training?" Walsh pressed, clearly intrigued by what he had just witnessed. Before Sarah could answer, the second ambulance arrived, and the trauma bay was once again filled with the urgent activity of emergency medicine. This time the patient was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with severe head trauma and multiple fractures. Sarah threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction from Walsh's questions. But as she worked on the second patient, she could feel the general's eyes on her from the observation window. There was something about his attention that felt different from the casual interest of the other observers. It felt personal, focused, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that she represented. The young woman's injuries were severe, but not immediately life-threatening. Sarah worked methodically, monitoring vital signs, administering medications, coordinating with the other staff members. Her movements were efficient and professional, but she was careful to stay within the boundaries of her role as a nurse. As the immediate crisis passed, and the patients were stabilized for transport to surgery, Sarah became aware of the conversations happening around her. Dr. Walsh was talking to the other staff members, his voice carrying a note of amazement. "I've never seen anything like that," he was saying. "She handled that emergency like she'd been doing it for years. Where did she say she got that training?" "She didn't say," Nurse Chen replied, her voice carrying a note of suspicion. "She just said she'd had, quote, additional training." "What kind of additional training teaches you to handle trauma like that?" Sarah could feel the speculation building around her, and she knew that her careful anonymity was beginning to crumble. She had revealed too much of herself in the heat of the emergency, and now people were asking questions that she wasn't prepared to answer. From the observation window, General Thompson was having his own conversation with his aide. "I want to know more about that nurse," he was saying. "There's something about her that's familiar." The aide made a note on his tablet. "Should I have someone look into her background, sir?" Discreetly, the general replied. I don't want to cause any problems for her, but there's something about her that I need to understand. As the trauma bay gradually returned to normal, Sarah found herself alone with the aftermath of what had just happened. She had saved 2 lives, but in doing so, she had revealed skills and knowledge that raised questions she wasn't ready to answer. The careful balance she had maintained between her past and her present was beginning to shift, and she wasn't sure she could control where it would lead. She cleaned up the trauma bay with methodical precision, her hands moving automatically through the familiar routine of post-emergency cleanup. But her mind was racing, trying to figure out how to handle the inevitable questions that would come. How could she explain her level of skill without revealing her military background? How could she maintain her anonymity when she had just demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond civilian nursing? The answer, she realized with a sinking feeling, was that she couldn't. The careful facade she had built over the past 8 months was beginning to crack, and she wasn't sure she could hold it together much longer. The 3rd ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, and with it came the moment that would change everything. Sarah was restocking supplies in Trauma Bay 2 when she heard the familiar sound of the emergency doors sliding open, followed by the urgent voices of the paramedics and the rhythmic squeak of gurney wheels on linoleum. 34-year-old female, motorcycle versus semi-truck, the lead paramedic called out as they wheeled the patient into the trauma bay. Multiple trauma, possible internal bleeding, unconscious since we arrived on scene. She's been touch and go for the past 10 minutes. Sarah moved toward the trauma bay, but something about the patient's appearance made her stop in her tracks. The woman on the gurney was young, with dark hair matted with blood, and a face that was swollen and bruised but still recognizably beautiful. She was wearing the torn remains of a leather jacket, and something about her overall appearance triggered a memory that Sarah had been trying to suppress for 5 years. It wasn't that the patient looked like Jessica Thompson. It was that she looked like Sarah herself had looked at that age, with the same dark hair, the same build, the same way of carrying herself even when unconscious. The resemblance was uncanny, and it hit Sarah like a physical blow. But it was what happened next that would destroy her carefully constructed anonymity forever. As the paramedics transferred the patient to the trauma bay bed, Sarah moved in to help with the transfer. The patient's leather jacket was torn and needed to be cut away to allow access to her injuries. Sarah reached for the trauma shears, her hands moving with practiced efficiency to remove the damaged clothing. But as she cut away the back of the jacket, her own scrub top caught on something and tore. The fabric pulled away from her left shoulder, creating a gap that exposed the skin beneath. For just a moment, less than a second, the small tattoo on her shoulder blade was visible. It was a tiny image, no bigger than a silver dollar, but it was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. A stylized angel figure with medical crosses for wings, surrounded by a circle that contained the words 3rd Medical Battalion, Alpha Company. Below the angel, in script so small it was barely readable, were the initials JT. From the observation window above, General Thompson was watching the trauma bay with the focused attention he brought to all medical emergencies. He had seen too many casualties, too many emergency procedures, to be squeamish about the reality of trauma medicine. But when Sarah's scrub top tore and the tattoo became visible, he went completely still. The general's aide noticed the change immediately. "Sir, is everything all right?" General Thompson didn't answer. He was staring at the small tattoo with an intensity that made everything else in the room fade into background noise. He knew that symbol. He knew those initials. He knew exactly what that tattoo meant, and who could have earned the right to wear it. 3rd Medical Battalion, Alpha Company, he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. The aide looked confused. "Sir, that's my daughter's unit," the general said, his voice stronger now but filled with a complex mixture of emotions. "That nurse down there served with Jessica." Below, in the trauma bay, Sarah was completely unaware of the attention from above. She was focused entirely on the patient, working with the same skilled efficiency she had demonstrated with the earlier cases. But there was something different about her approach to this particular patient. something more personal and intense. The patient's injuries were severe, but not immediately life-threatening. Sarah worked methodically, monitoring vital signs, cleaning wounds, preparing for whatever procedures Dr. Walsh would order. But as she worked, she found herself talking to the unconscious woman in a way that she hadn't talked to patients before. "Stay with me," she murmured as she checked the patient's pupils for signs of head trauma. "You're gonna be fine. You're strong, I can see that. Just keep fighting." Dr. Walsh arrived and began his examination, but Sarah found herself anticipating his needs, handing him instruments before he asked for them, adjusting equipment before he gave instructions. They worked together with a synchronization that surprised both of them. "Possible internal bleeding," Walsh observed, examining the patient's abdomen. "We need to get her to surgery." "BP is dropping," Sarah reported, her eyes on the monitors. "Pulse is getting weaker. We need to move fast." As they prepared the patient for transport to surgery, Sarah realized that her scrub top was still torn, the tattoo still partially visible. She tried to pull the fabric back into place, but it was too late. Several of the other staff members had noticed the marking, and she could see the curiosity in their eyes. "Is that a tattoo?" Dr. Foster asked, leaning in for a closer look. Sarah's heart rate spiked, but she kept her voice steady. "It's nothing important." "It looks military," Foster persisted. "Is that some kind of unit insignia?" Before Sarah could answer, the patient's condition deteriorated rapidly. The monitors began screaming warnings, and all attention focused on the immediate crisis. Sarah threw herself into the work, her military training taking over completely. She moved with a precision and authority that went far beyond her civilian role, calling out orders, coordinating with the other staff members, making decisions that probably should have come from the attending physician. But Dr. Walsh, recognizing her competence, stepped back and let her take the lead. "She's hemorrhaging internally," Sarah called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made similar assessments under fire. "We need to get her to surgery now, or we're going to lose her." The OR team arrived and took over, wheeling the patient away at a run. Sarah stood in the trauma bay, breathing hard, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. It was only then that she became aware of the silence that had fallen over the room. "Doctor," Walsh was staring at her with undisguised amazement. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" Sarah asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "Take charge like that. Make those kinds of assessments. Handle that kind of emergency pressure. That's not civilian training, Martinez. That's military medicine." Sarah felt trapped. Her carefully constructed anonymity was crumbling around her, and she could see the questions forming in everyone's eyes. She had revealed too much of herself, and now there was no way to put the genie back in the bottle. "I've had some experience with trauma cases," she said carefully, trying to find a way to deflect the questions without outright lying. "What kind of experience?" Walsh pressed. Before Sarah could answer, a voice from the trauma bay doorway cut through the conversation like a knife through silk. "The kind of experience that comes from serving with the 3rd Medical Battalion in Afghanistan." Everyone in the trauma bay turned to see General Thompson standing in the doorway, his dress uniform immaculate, his bearing commanding, his eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her feel like she was being examined under a microscope. The general stepped into the trauma bay, his attention focused entirely on Sarah. "That tattoo," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command and something else, something more personal. 3rd Medical Battalion, Alpha Company. The initials, J.T. Sarah, felt the blood drain from her face. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this, in front of her colleagues, with no time to prepare or find a way to deflect. "You knew my daughter," the general continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Jessica Thompson. You served with her." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the trauma bay was staring at Sarah, waiting for her response, trying to understand what was happening. Sarah could feel the weight of their attention, the pressure of the moment, the impossibility of continuing to hide. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew Jessica." The general stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "You were there when she died." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the certainty of someone who had spent years trying to piece together the final moments of his daughter's life. Sarah nodded slowly, unable to speak. The general's expression shifted, and for a moment the commanding officer disappeared, replaced by a father who had lost his child. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Tell me about Jessica." The trauma bay had become a theater of tension, with Sarah Martinez at the center of a drama she had spent 5 years trying to avoid. Dr. Walsh, Nurse Chen, Dr. Foster, and several other staff members stood frozen in place, their earlier medical emergency forgotten in the face of this unexpected revelation. The general's request hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's attention pressing down on her. "I can't," Sarah said finally, her voice stronger than she felt. "Not here, not like this." General Thompson's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that he understood more than he was letting on. "Then where? When?" Before Sarah could answer, Dr. Walsh stepped forward, his confusion evident in his voice. "I'm sorry, General, but I don't understand what's happening here. Martinez, you told us you had additional training, but you never mentioned military service." Sarah could feel the careful structure of her civilian life beginning to collapse around her. The questions she had been avoiding for 8 months were now unavoidable, and she was trapped in a room full of people who would never look at her the same way again. "I didn't think it was relevant," she said, knowing how inadequate that sounded even as she said it. Dr. Foster, who had been listening with growing excitement, jumped into the conversation. "You're a veteran, but you never mentioned it. We had no idea you had military experience." "There's a lot you don't know about me," Sarah replied, her voice carrying an edge that made several people step back. Nurse Chen, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, stepped forward with her clipboard clutched against her chest. "This is highly irregular. We need to notify administration immediately. If you've been misrepresenting your qualifications or your background, there could be serious consequences." The threat of bureaucratic action seemed to break something loose in Sarah. She had been running from her past for 5 years, trying to build a quiet life where she could practice medicine without the weight of her military service hanging over her. But now, faced with the possibility of losing even this refuge, she felt the familiar surge of defiance that had gotten her through 2 tours of duty. "Misrepresenting my qualifications?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "You just watched me save 3 lives in the span of 2 hours. You watched me handle emergencies that your precious Dr. Walsh was struggling with. What exactly am I misrepresenting?" Dr. Walsh bristled at the implication. "Now wait just a minute, Martinez. I don't know what kind of authority you think your military service gives you, but this is a civilian hospital with civilian protocols. You can't just take over trauma cases because you think you know better." "I don't think I know better," Sarah shot back. I know better. I've handled more trauma cases in combat conditions than you've seen in your entire career. I've performed surgery in the back of a moving vehicle under enemy fire. I've kept soldiers alive with improvised equipment and sheer determination. So don't lecture me about protocols when you were about to lose a patient because you couldn't handle the pressure." The room fell silent at her outburst. Sarah immediately regretted letting her temper get the better of her, but it was too late to take the words back. She had revealed more about herself in 30 seconds than she had in 8 months of careful anonymity. General Thompson had been watching the exchange with growing interest. Now he stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in private." "With respect, General," Nurse Chen interjected, "this is a hospital personnel matter. We need to follow proper procedures." The general's expression didn't change, but his voice carried a note of steel that made it clear he was not making a request. "Sergeant Martinez was under my command in Afghanistan. This is very much a military matter, and I will handle it accordingly." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She had been a corporal when she served under General Thompson, but she had been promoted to sergeant before her medical discharge. The fact that he knew her correct rank meant that he had been paying attention to her career, which was both surprising and deeply unsettling. "I need to speak with Sergeant Martinez privately," the general continued. "I'm sure you can understand that there are matters related to her service that cannot be discussed in a public forum." "Doctor," Walsh looked like he wanted to argue, but the general's presence and authority made dissent seem impossible. "Of course, General. We'll be in the break room if you need anything." As the other staff members filed out of the trauma bay, Sarah found herself alone with General Thompson for the first time in 5 years. The silence stretched between them, heavy with memories and unspoken grief. "Sergeant Martinez," the general said finally, his voice softer than it had been with the others. "Or do you prefer to be called by your civilian name now?" "Sarah is fine," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, then." He paused, studying her face. "You look different. Older. More tired." "It's been a long 5 years." "Yes," he agreed. "It has." The general moved to the window that overlooked the hospital's parking lot, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that Sarah remembered from briefings and debriefings in a different world. "I've been looking for you," he said quietly. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Looking for me?" "After Jessica died, I tried to find out what happened to the other members of her unit. Most of them were easy to track down. They stayed in the service, got promoted, continued their careers. But you disappeared. No forwarding address, no contact information, no trace of where you'd gone." "I wanted to disappear," Sarah said simply. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications and assumptions. Sarah knew that there were many possible answers, some truthful, some self-serving, some designed to protect both of them from the full weight of what had happened in Afghanistan. "Because I failed," she said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "Because I was supposed to keep her safe, and I didn't. Because I was supposed to be the experienced one, the one who knew how to handle combat medicine, and I let her die." The general turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "Is that what you think happened?" "I know what happened," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength. "I was there. I held her while she died. I tried to stop the bleeding, but there was too much damage. I failed her, and I failed you." "You failed me?" The general's voice carried a note of surprise. "She was your daughter. She was under my protection. I was supposed to bring her home." The general was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Sarah's face. "Is that why you have her initials tattooed on your shoulder?" Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to cover the tattoo, even though it was hidden beneath her scrub top. "It's how I remember her." "Tell me about that day," the general said quietly. "Tell me what really happened." Sarah felt her chest tighten. She had never talked about Jessica's death with anyone, not the counselors at the VA, not the chaplains who had tried to help her process her grief, not even the other members of her unit who had been there. The memories were too painful, too personal, too loaded with guilt and regret. "I can't," she said. "You can," the general replied. "And you will, because I've been living with questions for 5 years, and I think you're the only person who can answer them." Before Sarah could respond, the trauma bay door opened, and Dr. Walsh stuck his head in. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need Martinez back. We've got another emergency coming in." The general looked at Sarah, then at Dr. Walsh. "How long?" "Could be several hours," Walsh replied. "It's been a busy day." The general nodded. "Then we'll continue this conversation later. Sergeant Martinez, I'll be staying at the base tonight. I want to see you before I leave tomorrow." It wasn't a request, and Sarah knew better than to argue. "Yes, sir." As the general left the trauma bay, Sarah felt the weight of the impending conversation settling over her like a shroud. She had managed to avoid talking about Jessica's death for 5 years, but now it seemed that the past was finally catching up with her. Dr. Walsh was watching her with undisguised curiosity. Military service, huh? Why didn't you ever mention that? Sarah looked at him, then at the trauma bay around them, then at the monitors and equipment that had become her tools for trying to save lives in a civilian context. Because it's not who I am anymore, she said finally, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The events of the day had proven that her military training and experience were still very much a part of who she was. The question was whether she could continue to hide that part of herself, or whether it was time to stop running from the person she used to be. The answer, she realized, was about to be taken out of her hands. The rest of Sarah's shift passed in a blur of routine medical procedures and carefully avoided conversations. Word of her military background had spread through the hospital with the speed that only gossip could achieve, and she found herself the subject of whispered conversations and sideways glances wherever she went. Some of the staff members looked at her with new respect, others with suspicion, and a few with the kind of curiosity that made her skin crawl. Dr. Walsh had been surprisingly professional about the whole situation, treating her with a deference that felt uncomfortable after months of condescension. But Sarah could see the questions in his eyes, the calculations he was making about what her military experience meant for her role in the department. It was Nurse Chen who finally brought the bureaucratic hammer down. Sarah was finishing her documentation on the day's cases when Chen appeared at her workstation with a manila folder and the expression she reserved for serious administrative matters. "Martinez, I need to speak with you privately," Chen said, her voice carrying the formal tone that always preceded difficult conversations. Sarah followed her to a small conference room, adjacent to the main nursing station. Chen closed the door and spread the contents of the folder across the table. Sarah recognized some of the forms immediately: her original employment application, her nursing license verification, her background check documentation. "I've been reviewing your personnel file," Chen began, her voice carefully neutral, "and I've discovered some significant discrepancies." Sarah's heart sank. She had known this was coming, but she had hoped to have more time to prepare. On your employment application, you listed your previous experience as, quote, private healthcare facility and, quote, trauma center experience. You made no mention of military service, combat medicine, or any specialized training that might be relevant to your position here. "I didn't think it was relevant," Sarah replied, knowing how weak that sounded. "Not relevant?" Chen's voice rose slightly. "You've been handling trauma cases with a level of skill and authority that goes far beyond your stated qualifications. You've been making medical decisions that should be coming from physicians, not nurses. And now I discover that you have extensive military medical training that you failed to disclose?" Sarah could feel the careful structure of her civilian life beginning to collapse around her. "My nursing license is valid. My credentials are legitimate. I've never done anything that compromised patient care." "That's not the point," Chen shot back. "The point is that you misrepresented yourself during the hiring process. You failed to disclose relevant experience and training. That's grounds for immediate termination." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known this job was temporary, that she would eventually have to move on and start over somewhere else. But she hadn't expected it to end like this, with accusations and threats, and the destruction of the quiet anonymity she had worked so hard to build. "I understand your position," Sarah said carefully, "but I would like to point out that my performance has been exemplary. I've never missed a shift, never had a patient complaint, and as you witnessed today, I've handled emergency situations with competence and professionalism." "Under false pretenses," Chen replied. "You've been practicing medicine under false pretenses." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock on the conference room door. Dr. Walsh entered without waiting for permission, his expression serious. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I think there's something you both need to know." Chen looked annoyed at the interruption. "Dr. Walsh, we're in the middle of a personnel matter." "Which is exactly why you need to hear this," Walsh replied. He turned to Sarah. "I just got a call from the OR. That motorcycle accident patient, the one you worked on this afternoon, she's going to make it. The surgeon said that if you hadn't identified the internal bleeding when you did, If you hadn't stabilized her for transport, she would have died. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and vindication, but Chen's expression remained stern. That's very commendable, Chen said, but it doesn't change the fact that Martinez misrepresented her qualifications. Walsh sat down at the conference table, his expression thoughtful. Actually, I think it does change things. I've been thinking about this afternoon about what I witnessed in those trauma bays. Martinez didn't just handle those emergencies competently. She handled them with a level of skill that I've rarely seen, even from experienced emergency physicians. The point is that she lied about her background, Chen insisted. Did she? Walsh asked. Or did she simply choose not to volunteer information that she felt was personal? Sarah looked at him in surprise. She hadn't expected him to defend her, especially after the way she had spoken to him earlier. Think about it, Walsh continued. She never claimed to be anything other than a qualified nurse. She never overstepped her bounds until today, when emergency situations required her to use skills that she clearly possessed. And when she did use those skills, she saved lives. Chen looked like she wanted to argue, but Walsh wasn't finished. I've been practicing emergency medicine for 15 years, he said. I've worked with nurses who had military medical training before, and I can tell you that they're some of the most skilled and competent medical professionals I've ever encountered. The fact that Martinez chose not to advertise her military background doesn't make her a liar. It makes her someone who wanted to be judged on her civilian qualifications. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward Walsh, but she could see that Chen wasn't convinced. Hospital policy is clear, Chen said. All relevant experience and training must be disclosed during the hiring process. Martinez violated that policy. Quote, Then maybe we need to reconsider that policy, Walsh replied. Maybe we need to ask ourselves why someone with Martinez's level of training and experience would choose to hide it. Maybe we need to consider that there might be valid reasons for wanting to start over in civilian medicine. The conference room fell silent as the implications of Walsh's words sank in. Sarah could see Chen calculating, weighing the administrative requirements against the practical realities of what had happened. I'll need to discuss this with administration, Chen said finally. And with legal. There are procedures to follow. Of course, Walsh agreed. But I think it's important that we consider the full picture. Martinez saved 3 lives today. That's not something we should dismiss lightly. As Chen gathered her papers and left the conference room, Sarah found herself alone with Dr. Walsh. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what had been said and what remained unspoken. Why did you do that? Sarah asked finally. Walsh was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Because I realized something this afternoon. I've been treating you like a new graduate, like someone who needed constant supervision and guidance. But you're not, are you? You're probably more experienced than I am, at least in trauma medicine. Sarah didn't know how to respond to that. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, Walsh continued, about handling trauma cases in combat conditions, about performing surgery under enemy fire. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. It was a different world, Sarah said quietly. But it's still part of who you are, Walsh replied. And maybe that's something we should be celebrating, not hiding. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the tight control she had maintained over her emotions for the past 5 years. I didn't want to be defined by my military service, she said. I wanted to be judged on my abilities as a nurse, not on my past. But your past is part of your abilities, Walsh pointed out. Your military training, your combat experience, your specialized skills, they all contribute to what makes you an exceptional nurse. Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and felt her stomach drop. The message was from an unknown number, but the content was unmistakable. This is General Thompson. I'm staying at the base tonight. I'll expect you in my office at 0800 tomorrow morning. We have unfinished business to discuss. Sarah stared at the text message until the words blurred together, her mind racing through possibilities and escape routes that no longer existed. Dr. Walsh was watching her with growing concern, but before either of them could speak, Sarah's phone buzzed again with another notification. This time, it wasn't a text message. It was a notification from the hospital's internal staff communication app, a group chat that included most of the emergency department personnel. Someone had posted a video, and Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized what she was looking at. The video was grainy, obviously shot on someone's phone from the observation window overlooking the trauma bays. It showed Sarah working on the motorcycle accident patient, her movements quick and efficient, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. But what made Sarah's heart sink was the timestamp showing that the video had been recorded during the moments when her scrub top was torn, when her tattoo was clearly visible. The caption read, "Nurse Martinez handling trauma like a boss. Turns out she's got military ink. Who knew our quiet little Martinez was hiding secrets?" Within minutes, the comments began appearing. Some were supportive, expressing admiration for Sarah's skills and respect for her service. But others carried a different tone, one that made Sarah's stomach churn with familiar dread. "So she's been lying about her background this whole time?" wrote someone using the handle NurseLife 2019. "Explains why she never talks about herself," added another comment. "What else is she hiding?" "Military types always think they're better than everyone else," posted someone Sarah didn't recognize from the emergency department. "Probably thinks civilian medicine is beneath her." Dr. Walsh was reading over Sarah's shoulder, his expression growing darker with each comment. "This is completely inappropriate," he said. "Who posted this video?" Sarah scrolled up to check the original poster and felt another jolt of recognition. It was Dr. Amanda Foster, the young resident who had been so curious about Sarah's tattoo earlier. The posting came with what appeared to be genuine admiration, but Sarah knew how quickly online conversations could spiral out of control. As if summoned by their discussion of her, Dr. Foster appeared in the conference room doorway, her face flushed with excitement. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind that I posted that video. You looked so amazing handling that emergency, and I thought people should see how skilled you are." "You posted a video of me without my permission," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. "It's just the staff chat," Foster replied, seemingly oblivious to Sarah's tone. "I thought it would help people understand what you're really capable of. I mean, military medical training is seriously impressive." Sarah could feel her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "You had no right to record me while I was working, and you certainly had no right to post it online." "Online?" Foster looked confused. "It's just our internal chat." Dr. Walsh leaned forward, his expression serious. "Amanda, internal hospital communications can be accessed by administration, legal, and potentially external agencies depending on the circumstances. Nothing posted on hospital networks is truly private." The color drained from Foster's face as the implications began to sink in. "I didn't think about that. I just wanted people to know how amazing Sarah is." But the damage was already done. Sarah's phone continued to buzz with notifications as more people viewed the video and added their comments. Some were colleagues from other departments who had never paid attention to her before, but were now expressing curiosity about her background. Others were from people she didn't recognize, possibly staff from other shifts or departments. The worst part was watching the narrative begin to shift in real time. What had started as admiration for her medical skills was gradually morphing into speculation about her motivations, her honesty, and her fitness for civilian medical practice. Why would someone with that level of training want to work as a regular nurse? Someone had posted. Something doesn't add up. "Maybe she got kicked out of the military," suggested another comment. "Medical discharge doesn't always mean honorable discharge." "Or maybe she's one of those PTSD cases who can't handle civilian life," added a third voice. Sarah felt each comment like a physical blow. These people didn't know her story, didn't understand the complex reasons why someone might want to leave military medicine behind. But they felt entitled to speculate, to judge, to dissect her choices based on a 30-second video clip. Dr. Walsh was watching the comment thread with growing anger. "This is completely unacceptable," he said. "Half of these people don't even work in our department. How did this spread so quickly?" The answer came in the form of another notification. Someone had shared the video to a larger hospital-wide group chat, one that included administrative staff, security personnel, and employees from every department. What had started as a small emergency department conversation had now become hospital-wide gossip. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to get some air." "Sarah, wait," Dr. Walsh called after her, but she was already moving toward the door. She walked quickly through the hospital corridors, her head down, trying to avoid eye contact with the colleagues and staff members who seemed to be looking at her with new interest. She could feel their stares, hear the whispered conversations that stopped when she passed, sense the shift in how people perceived her. The hospital's employee break area had a small outdoor patio, supposedly designed for staff to decompress during difficult shifts. Sarah pushed through the glass doors and found herself alone in the cool Colorado evening air. The mountains were visible in the distance, their peaks outlined against the darkening sky, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine disappearing into those peaks, starting over yet again in some place where nobody knew her name or her story. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call rather than a text or notification. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it triggered a memory that made her heart race. "Hello?" she answered cautiously. "Sarah Martinez?" The voice was male, older, with the kind of authority that came from years of military service. "Who is this?" "Colonel James Mitchell, Public Affairs Office, Fort Mitchell. I understand you served with the 3rd Medical Battalion." Sarah felt the world shift around her. "How did you get this number?" "General Thompson requested that I reach out to you. There's been some interest in your background following today's events at the hospital." "What kind of interest?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The kind that requires careful management," Colonel Mitchell replied diplomatically. "I think it would be beneficial for all parties if we could arrange a meeting to discuss the situation." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed civilian life closing in around her. "Is this about Jessica?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Among other things, yes. General Thompson has some questions that only you can answer, and frankly, the attention you're receiving right now makes it important that we address those questions sooner rather than later." "Attention? What attention?" "The video of you working in the trauma bay has been shared beyond your hospital's internal networks, military blogs, social media, veteran forums. People are curious about the nurse with the combat medic tattoo who handles emergencies like she's been doing it in war zones." Sarah felt sick. What had started as Dr. Foster's well-intentioned attempt to show appreciation for her skills had somehow escaped the confines of the hospital and was now spreading across the internet. She could imagine the speculation, the theories, the attempts to piece together her story from fragments of information. "I never wanted this kind of attention," she said quietly. "I understand that," Colonel Mitchell replied. "But unfortunately, we don't always get to control how our stories are told. The question now is whether you want to be part of shaping the narrative or whether you want to let others do it for you." Before Sarah could respond, she heard footsteps on the patio behind her. She turned to see Dr. Walsh approaching, his expression concerned. "I need to go," she told Colonel Mitchell. "The general is expecting you tomorrow morning at 0800, he reminded her. "I hope you'll reconsider attending that meeting. There are things you need to know, Sarah, things about Jessica's death that you might not be aware of." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone while Dr. Walsh waited nearby. "Everything okay?" he asked. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Define okay." She showed him her phone, scrolling through the notifications that continued to pile up. The video had been shared to Facebook groups for military veterans, uploaded to YouTube with speculative commentary, and posted on Reddit forums where people were trying to identify her unit and piece together her service record. "This is insane," Dr. Walsh said, reading through some of the comments. "How did a 30-second hospital video turn into this?" "Because people love a mystery," Sarah replied bitterly, "and because social media turns everything into entertainment." One particular comment thread caught their attention. Someone claiming to have served in Afghanistan was speculating about Sarah's unit, her deployment dates, and the circumstances that might have led to her leaving the military. The speculation was wildly inaccurate, but it was being shared and discussed as if it were fact. "We need to shut this down," Dr. Walsh said. "I'll talk to administration about getting the original video removed from our internal networks." "It's too late for that," Sarah replied. "Once something goes viral, you can't put it back in the bottle." As if to prove her point, her phone rang again. This time it was a number she recognized from the hospital's administration office. "Ms. Martinez, this is Director Patricia Hawthorne from Human Resources. I need you to come to my office immediately." "It's almost 8 p.m., Sarah pointed out. "I'm aware of the time. This is an urgent matter that cannot wait until tomorrow." Sarah looked at Dr. Walsh, who was shaking his head. "I'll come with you," he offered. "That won't be necessary," Director Hawthorne's voice carried through the phone. "This is a private personnel matter." 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself sitting across from Director Hawthorne in an office that felt more like an interrogation room than a place for employee discussions. Hawthorne was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she had dealt with difficult situations before. "I'm sure you're aware of why you're here," Hawthorne began without preamble. "I assume it's about the video that was posted earlier." "Among other things, yes. I've received calls from 3 different media outlets in the past hour asking about the military nurse who works at our hospital. Apparently your story has captured some attention online." Sarah felt her heart sink. Media outlets? A local news station, a military publication, and something called Hero Stories Network. They all want to do interviews about your background and your transition from military to civilian medicine. "I don't want to do any interviews. That's your choice, of course. But the attention isn't going away just because you don't want it. In fact, our legal department is concerned about potential liability issues." "Liability issues?" Sarah asked, confused. "If it comes out that you are practicing medicine under misrepresented credentials, if there are questions about your discharge from the military or your fitness for civilian practice, the hospital could face legal and public relations challenges." Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger that had been building all day. "My credentials are legitimate. My nursing license is valid. I've never done anything that compromised patient care or violated hospital policies, except for failing to disclose relevant background information during the hiring process," Hawthorne pointed out. "Which wasn't required," Sarah shot back. "I answered every question on the application honestly. I provided all the documentation that was requested. I never claimed to be anything other than a qualified nurse." Hawthorne consulted a file on her desk. "Be that as it may, the current situation is untenable. We have media attention, social media speculation, and questions about your background that we cannot answer because you chose not to provide that information. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that we need to resolve this situation quickly and decisively. Either you provide a full accounting of your military service and the circumstances of your discharge, or we'll have to consider other options." The threat was clear, even if it wasn't stated explicitly. Sarah could provide the details of her military service that she had spent 5 years trying to keep private, or she could face termination. "I need time to think about this," Sarah said. "Time is something we don't have," Hawthorne replied. "The story is spreading online, and we need to be prepared with accurate information before it gets completely out of control." Sarah's phone buzzed with another notification, and she glanced at it despite herself. Someone had posted a photo of her leaving the hospital earlier, taken from a distance but clearly showing her face. The caption read, "Mystery military nurse leaving St. Mary's Hospital. What is she hiding?" She showed the photo to Hawthorne, whose expression grew even more serious. "This changes things," Hawthorne said. "If people are now taking photos of you outside the hospital, this has moved beyond simple social media gossip. This is now a security and privacy concern. What do you want me to do about it? Sarah asked, feeling trapped and increasingly desperate. I want you to consider that maybe the best way to end the speculation is to tell your story yourself, on your own terms, before someone else tells it for you. The office fell silent as Sarah considered her options. She could continue trying to maintain her privacy and anonymity, but it seemed clear that ship had already sailed. She could quit her job and disappear again, start over in another city with another identity, but the internet had made that kind of escape much more difficult than it used to be. Or she could face the truth that she had been running from for 5 years and finally tell the story of what happened to Jessica Thompson on a dusty road outside Kandahar. The choice, she realized, was no longer really hers to make. Sarah left the hospital that evening feeling like she was walking through a nightmare that refused to end. The employee parking garage, usually empty and quiet at this time of night, felt different now. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential photographer. Every sound made her wonder if someone was following her. She had never realized how exposed civilian life could make someone who was accustomed to the controlled environment of military bases. Her apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit in a complex that catered mostly to hospital staff and other shift workers. She had chosen it specifically for its anonymity and lack of community interaction. No social events, no neighborly small talk, no curious questions about her background. It had been perfect for someone who wanted to disappear into civilian life. Now, as she climbed the stairs to her second-floor unit, she found herself checking corners and maintaining situational awareness in a way she hadn't done since Afghanistan. The notification settings on her phone had been turned off hours ago, but she could still see the screen lighting up periodically with new messages, comments, and friend requests from people she didn't know. Inside her apartment, Sarah finally allowed herself to collapse onto her couch and survey the wreckage of her carefully constructed civilian life. She opened her laptop and made the mistake of searching for her own name online. The results were worse than she had expected. The original video from the hospital had been downloaded and re-uploaded to multiple platforms, each with its own speculation and commentary. Military blogs were analyzing her movements and techniques, trying to determine her training background and deployment history. Social media groups were sharing theories about why she had left the military and what she might be hiding. Most disturbingly, someone had managed to connect her current name with fragments of her military service record. Nothing classified or detailed, but enough to confirm that Sarah Martinez had indeed served with the 3rd Medical Battalion in Afghanistan. From there, it was only a matter of time before someone made the connection to Jessica Thompson's death. Sarah closed the laptop and walked to her bedroom, where she opened the bottom drawer of her dresser and pulled out a small wooden box that she hadn't opened in months. Inside were the remnants of her military life, her discharge papers, a few photographs, some letters she had never sent, and Jessica Thompson's dog tags. She had never been able to explain, even to herself, why she had kept Jessica's tags. They should have been returned to General Thompson with the rest of his daughter's personal effects. But in the chaos and grief that followed Jessica's death, Sarah had somehow ended up with them, and she had never found the courage to return them. The tags were warm in her palm, the metal worn smooth by years of handling. Jessica Lynn Thompson, B-negative, Methodist. 26 years old when she died, younger than Sarah was now. It occurred to Sarah that she had now lived longer without Jessica than she had known her, but the guilt and grief felt as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. Her phone rang, startling her from her memories. The caller ID showed her sister Maria's number, which was unexpected since they rarely talked more than once or twice a year. "Maria!" Sarah answered. "Sarah, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Why wouldn't I be?" "Because your face is all over Facebook, that's why. Mom saw some video of you working at a hospital, and now everyone's talking about how you were in the Army. Since when were you in the Army?" Sarah closed her eyes. She had never told her family about her military service. creating an elaborate fiction about working for a private medical company overseas. It had seemed easier than explaining the truth, easier than dealing with their questions and concerns. It's complicated, Maria. Complicated? Sarah, there are people online saying you were some kind of special forces medic or something. Is that true? I was a combat medic, not special forces. Combat medic? Maria's voice rose an octave. You were in combat? When? Where? Why didn't you tell us? Sarah could hear the hurt in her sister's voice, and she realized that her attempts to protect her family from the truth had only succeeded in creating more distance between them. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan, Sarah said quietly. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to worry. We worried anyway, Maria replied. When you disappeared for 3 years and barely stayed in touch, when you came back different and wouldn't talk about where you'd been, when you moved to Colorado and started working at some hospital instead of the big medical career you always talked about. We worried, Sarah. We just didn't know what we were worrying about. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Sarah providing carefully edited versions of her service record while avoiding any mention of Jessica Thompson or the circumstances of her discharge. By the time she hung up, she felt emotionally drained and more isolated than ever. She made herself a simple dinner, but couldn't bring herself to eat it. Instead, she sat on her couch and stared out the window at the city lights, thinking about the meeting with General Thompson that awaited her in the morning. She had been dreading that conversation for 5 years, but now that it was finally unavoidable, she found herself almost relieved. The worst part of carrying grief and guilt is the weight of carrying it alone. Sarah had spent 5 years constructing elaborate defenses against anyone who might get close enough to ask difficult questions. She had built a life of careful anonymity and emotional distance, telling herself that it was necessary for her healing, that she needed space and time to process what had happened in Afghanistan. But tonight, surrounded by the digital wreckage of her privacy and facing the prospect of finally telling the truth about Jessica's death, Sarah began to wonder if her isolation had been healing or hiding. Had she been processing her grief, or had she simply been avoiding it? Her laptop chimed with a new email notification. Against her better judgment, she opened it to find a message from someone claiming to be a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell her story. The subject line read, "The Hidden Heroes, Military Medics in Civilian Life." Sarah deleted the email without reading it, but it was followed by another, and then another. Requests for interviews, invitations to speak at veteran events, offers to help her tell her story to the world. Everyone, it seemed, wanted a piece of her narrative, wanted to turn her experience into content for their own purposes. She turned off the laptop and went to bed, but sleep was elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself back on that dusty road outside Kandahar, feeling Jessica's blood on her hands, hearing the sound of the IED explosion that had changed everything. The memories that she had worked so hard to suppress were flooding back with a clarity that took her breath away. At 3 a.m, Sarah gave up on sleep and made herself coffee. She sat at her kitchen table and began writing in a notebook, something she hadn't done since her early days in therapy at the VA. She wrote about Jessica, about their friendship, about the day she died. She wrote about her guilt and her grief, about her decision to leave the military, about her 5 years of hiding in civilian life. Writing had always helped her think more clearly. And as the words flowed onto the page, Sarah began to understand something that had been eluding her. She hadn't been protecting herself by hiding her military service. She had been protecting the memory of Jessica Thompson. As long as Sarah remained anonymous, as long as her story stayed untold, Jessica's death remained a private tragedy rather than a public spectacle. Sarah had convinced herself that she was honoring Jessica's memory by keeping it secret, by refusing to let it become part of someone else's narrative about military sacrifice or combat medicine. But now, faced with the inevitable exposure of her story, Sarah began to wonder if she had been wrong, Maybe Jessica's memory deserved better than silence. Maybe her story deserved to be told by someone who loved her and understood what she had meant to the people who served with her. By the time the sun rose over the Colorado mountains, Sarah had made her decision. She would go to the meeting with General Thompson, and she would tell him everything. Not because she was being forced to, not because the media attention made it inevitable, but because Jessica Thompson deserved to have her story told by someone who had been there, someone who understood what she had given and what her death had cost. Sarah showered, put on her best civilian clothes, and pinned Jessica's dog tags inside her jacket, over her heart. Then she drove toward Fort Mitchell, toward a conversation that was 5 years overdue, carrying the truth that she had been too afraid to share. The guard at the base entrance recognized her name on the visitor list and provided directions to General Thompson's office. As Sarah drove through the familiar landscape of a military installation, she felt the careful boundaries between her past and present beginning to dissolve. She was no longer just Sarah Martinez, civilian nurse. She was Sergeant Sarah Martinez, combat medic, friend of Jessica Thompson, keeper of secrets that were finally ready to be told. General Thompson's office was located in a building that Sarah recognized as typical military administrative architecture. Functional, austere, designed to convey authority rather than comfort. She arrived precisely at 0800, her military training making punctuality automatic, even after 5 years in civilian life. The receptionist, a young corporal with the kind of crisp uniform that suggested he was new to his position, directed her to wait in a conference room adjacent to the general's office. The room was sparse but dignified, with an American flag in one corner and photographs of military ceremonies lining the walls. Sarah found herself studying the images, recognizing the formal rituals of military life that she had once taken for granted. Change of command ceremonies, medal presentations, graduation events from various military schools. It was a visual reminder of the world she had left behind, and of the traditions that Jessica Thompson would never get to participate in. When General Thompson entered the room, Sarah automatically stood and came to attention, muscle memory overriding 5 years of civilian conditioning. The general was in dress uniform, his bearing still impressive, despite the weight of grief and years that had settled on his shoulders since Afghanistan. "At ease, Sergeant Martinez," he said quietly, and Sarah relaxed slightly but remained standing until he gestured for her to sit. They sat across from each other at the conference table, and for a moment neither spoke. Sarah could see Jessica in her father's features. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, the same way of holding themselves with quiet confidence. The resemblance was both comforting and heartbreaking. "Thank you for coming," the general said finally. "I know this isn't easy for you." "No, sir, it's not." General Thompson opened a folder that Sarah recognized as an official military file. Her file, she realized, complete with service records, medical reports, and what appeared to be several official documents that she had never seen before. "I've been reviewing your service record," he said. 2 tours in Afghanistan, multiple commendations, exemplary performance reviews. According to your commanding officers, you were one of the finest combat medics they had ever worked with." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she remained silent. "But what's interesting," the general continued, "is what's not in your file. There's no detailed report of the incident that led to Jessica's death, no after-action review, no investigation, no comprehensive accounting of what happened that day." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Sir, I submitted my report to my commanding officer. I told them everything I could remember." "Yes, you did, but your report was classified and buried so deep that it took me 5 years and considerable influence to get access to it." He pulled out a document that Sarah recognized as her own handwriting, though she barely remembered writing it in the chaos that followed Jessica's death. "According to your report," the general said, reading from the paper, "you and Jessica were part of a medical team responding to casualties from an IED attack on a supply convoy. Your vehicle was hit by a secondary device while you were treating wounded soldiers. Jessica sustained critical injuries in the blast, and despite your efforts to treat her, she died approximately 20 minutes later." "That's correct, sir. But that's not the whole story, is it, Sergeant?" Sarah looked up at him, surprised by the question. "Sir?" General Thompson reached into the folder and pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the Department of Defense and marked with classification stamps that Sarah didn't recognize. "This is the after-action report that was compiled by the investigation team that examined the incident," he said. "It took me 3 years to get clearance to read it, and another 2 years to get permission to discuss it with you." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. "I don't understand, sir. The investigation concluded that the secondary IED that killed Jessica was not a random attack. It was specifically targeting medical personnel. Intelligence reports suggest that your medical team had been under surveillance for several days, and that the attack was designed to eliminate key medical personnel who had been saving too many coalition lives." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had always assumed that Jessica's death was a tragic accident, a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The idea that it had been a deliberate assassination attempt was almost too horrible to contemplate. "Furthermore," the general continued, "the investigation found that your actions during and after the attack prevented the complete loss of the medical team by staying with Jessica instead of seeking cover, by continuing to treat wounded soldiers while under fire. You saved at least 6 lives that day." Sarah stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "That's not—" "I didn't." "You did," the general said firmly. "And more than that, the intelligence gathered from that incident led to the identification and elimination of the terrorist cell responsible for targeting medical personnel. Your actions that day saved not just the lives of the soldiers with you, but potentially hundreds of other medical personnel who would have been targeted in future attacks." Sarah felt the careful structure of her guilt and self-recrimination beginning to crumble. For 5 years she had carried the weight of believing that she had failed Jessica, that her inability to save her friend's life was evidence of her inadequacy as a medic and as a soldier. "Jessica knew," the general said quietly. "According to the witness statements, she was conscious for most of the time you were treating her. She knew that you were staying with her instead of seeking cover. She knew that you were risking your own life to try to save hers." "She told me to leave," Sarah whispered, the memory flooding back with painful clarity. "She told me to get to cover, to save myself." "But you didn't leave." "No, sir. I couldn't." "That's exactly what Jessica would have done," the general said, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, his voice carried a note of warmth, rather than just authority. "She would have stayed. She would have risked everything to save a friend." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion and revelation. Sarah felt years of carefully suppressed grief and guilt beginning to surface, but for the first time it wasn't entirely overwhelming. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because you deserve to know the truth," the general replied. "And because Jessica deserved to have her sacrifice understood and honored." He reached into the folder one more time and pulled out an object that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was a Medal of Valor, the military's recognition for extraordinary heroism in combat, along with an official citation bearing her name. "This was approved 3 years ago," the general said. "But it required your presence to receive it, and we couldn't locate you." Sarah stared at the medal, unable to comprehend that her actions on the worst day of her life were being recognized as heroic rather than inadequate. "I don't deserve this," she said quietly. "You do," the general replied. "And more than that, you deserve to know that Jessica's death wasn't your failure. It was her choice to serve, your choice to stay with her, and the enemy's choice to target medical personnel. But your choices that day honored everything that military medicine stands for." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock on the conference room door. Colonel Mitchell, the public affairs officer who had called her the night before, entered with what appeared to be a small group of other military personnel. "General, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development with the media situation." General Thompson frowned. "What kind of development?" "The story about Sergeant Martinez has been picked up by several major news outlets. CNN, Fox News, Military Times. They're all running stories about the mystery combat medic who's been working as a civilian nurse. We're getting calls from reporters asking for confirmation and comment. Sarah felt her heart sink. She had hoped that the attention would die down, but it seemed to be escalating beyond anything she had imagined. "What are they reporting?" the general asked. Colonel Mitchell consulted his tablet. "Most of it is speculation based on the hospital video and social media research, but one outlet has connected Sergeant Martinez to the 3rd Medical Battalion and to—" He paused, glancing at Sarah. "To Jessica's death." The general's expression hardened. "How much do they know?" "Not much in terms of specifics, but enough to be asking questions about classified operations and requesting official statements about what happened in Afghanistan." Sarah felt trapped between her desire for privacy and the apparent inevitability of having her story become public knowledge. "What does this mean for me?" "It means," the general said after a moment's consideration, "that we have a choice to make. We can let others tell your story based on speculation and incomplete information, or we can tell it ourselves, accurately, and with the respect that both you and Jessica deserve." "I don't want to be famous," Sarah said quietly. "I just wanted to do my job and be left alone." "I understand that," the general replied. "But sometimes our stories are bigger than our personal preferences. Sometimes they matter to people beyond ourselves." Colonel Mitchell cleared his throat. "There's something else, sir. We've been receiving calls from other veterans, particularly combat medics, who are saying that Sergeant Martinez's story represents something important about military medical personnel and their transition to civilian life." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "Apparently, your situation, highly trained military medical personnel working in civilian positions without recognition or appropriate utilization of their skills, is more common than people realized. Veterans organizations are saying that your story highlights systemic problems with how military medical personnel are integrated into civilian health care." The general leaned back in his chair, considering. "So this has moved beyond just Sarah's personal story." "Yes, sir. It's becoming a broader conversation about veterans in health care, about the value of military medical training, and about how civilian institutions can better utilize the skills of former military medical personnel." Sarah looked around the room at the military personnel, who were discussing her life as if it were a policy issue rather than a personal crisis. She understood the logic of what they were saying, but it felt surreal to have her private struggles become part of a larger conversation about veteran affairs. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. General Thompson was quiet for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. "I want you to consider that maybe Jessica's story deserves to be told. Not as entertainment, not as a curiosity, but as a tribute to what she represented and what she gave." "And what about my story?" "Your story is part of hers," he replied. "You were her friend, her partner, the person who was with her at the end. If her story is going to be told, it should be told by someone who loved her and understood what she meant." Sarah felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She could continue fighting for her privacy, continue trying to hide from the attention, but it seemed clear that the choice was no longer entirely hers to make. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "if I agree to tell our story, I want to do it on my terms. I want to make sure that Jessica is remembered as more than just a casualty, and I want to make sure that the truth about what happened is told correctly." "That's exactly what I was hoping you would say," the general replied. And for the first time in 5 years, Sarah began to think that maybe it was time to stop hiding from the truth. 3 days after her meeting with General Thompson, Sarah found herself standing backstage at the Fort Mitchell Community Center, preparing for what would be the most difficult conversation of her life. The auditorium was filled with a mixture of military personnel, hospital staff, local media, and veterans from across Colorado who had driven hours to hear her story. The decision to go public hadn't been easy, but once Sarah had committed to telling Jessica's story, Events had moved with military efficiency. Colonel Mitchell and his public affairs team had worked with Sarah to craft a narrative that honored both Jessica's sacrifice and the broader issues facing military medical personnel transitioning to civilian life. Dr. Walsh had surprised Sarah by asking to attend the event, bringing with him several colleagues from St. Mary's Hospital. Even Nurse Chen had come, though she maintained her characteristic professional distance. Most surprisingly, Dr. Foster had approached Sarah before the event to apologize for posting the original video that had started everything. "I never imagined it would turn into this," Foster had said, gesturing toward the crowded auditorium. "I just thought people should know how skilled you are." Sarah had accepted the apology with grace, understanding that Foster's intentions had been good, even if the consequences had been overwhelming. In a strange way, she was beginning to realize that the viral video had forced her to confront truths about herself that she had been avoiding for 5 years. General Thompson took the stage first, his presence commanding immediate attention from the audience. He spoke about military medical personnel, about the unique challenges they faced in combat, and about the difficulty of transitioning those skills to civilian life. His words were measured and professional, but Sarah could hear the personal pain underlying his formal remarks. "Today, we're here to honor 2 people," the general said, his voice carrying across the hushed auditorium. "One who gave her life in service to her country, and one who has spent the last 5 years serving her community while carrying the weight of that loss in silence." Quote. He paused, his gaze finding Sarah in the wings. "Staff Sergeant Jessica Lynn Thompson was my daughter, but more importantly, she was a combat medic who embodied everything we hope to see in military medical personnel. She was skilled, compassionate, brave, and utterly devoted to saving lives." A large screen behind the general displayed a photograph that Sarah hadn't seen in years. Jessica in her Army combat uniform, smiling at the camera with the confidence of someone who had found her calling. The image hit Sarah like a physical blow, bringing back memories of Jessica's laugh, her terrible jokes during long shifts at the field hospital, her unwavering optimism even in the worst circumstances. Jessica died on a dusty road outside Kandahar while trying to save wounded soldiers, the general continued. But she didn't die alone. She died in the arms of her friend and fellow medic, someone who stayed with her when she could have sought safety, someone who risked everything to try to save her. Sarah felt her hands trembling as the general gestured for her to join him on stage. The walk from the wings to the podium felt endless, every step weighted with 5 years of grief, guilt, and carefully maintained silence. The audience was completely quiet as Sarah approached the microphone. She could see familiar faces in the crowd, her colleagues from the hospital, veterans who understood the weight of military service, family members of fallen soldiers who carried their own burdens of loss. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she began, her voice stronger than she felt. "5 years ago, I was Staff Sergeant Martinez, and I served as a combat medic with the 3rd Medical Battalion in Afghanistan. Jessica Thompson was my partner, my friend, and one of the finest medics I ever had the privilege to serve with." She paused, gathering her courage for what came next. "Jessica died on March 15, 2019, during what we thought was a routine medical evacuation. We were responding to casualties from an IED attack when our vehicle was hit by a secondary device. For 5 years, I've carried the guilt of believing that I failed to save her. Today, I learned that I was wrong about almost everything I thought I knew about that day." Sarah went on to explain what General Thompson had revealed about the targeted nature of the attack, about the intelligence value of their survival, about the lives that had been saved because of the actions she had taken while Jessica was dying. She spoke about her decision to leave the military, about her struggle to find purpose in civilian life, about the way military medical training had shaped her approach to emergency medicine. "I didn't talk about my military service because I thought I was protecting Jessica's memory," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "I thought that by keeping our story private, I was honoring what she had given. But silence isn't honor. Silence is just another form of hiding. She reached into her jacket and pulled out Jessica's dog tags, holding them up so the audience could see them. I've carried these for 5 years because I couldn't find the courage to return them to General Thompson. I told myself it was because I wasn't ready to let go, but the truth is that I was afraid to face the questions they represented. The auditorium was absolutely silent, hundreds of people hanging on every word. Sarah could see tears in the eyes of some veterans, recognition and understanding in the faces of others who had carried similar burdens. Jessica Thompson didn't die because I failed her, Sarah continued. She died because she chose to serve, because she was willing to risk everything to save wounded soldiers, because she embodied everything that military medicine represents. And I've learned that the best way to honor her memory isn't to hide from our story, but to make sure that people understand what she gave and why it mattered. Sarah went on to talk about her experience as a civilian nurse, about the challenges of transitioning military medical skills to civilian healthcare, about the veterans who were working in hospitals and clinics across the country without recognition or appropriate utilization of their training. There are hundreds of former military medical personnel working in civilian healthcare, she said. Combat medics working as nursing assistants, military surgeons working as residents, helicopter flight medics working as EMTs. We're there, we're serving, but we're often invisible because we don't talk about our military experience. She spoke about the assumptions people made about veterans, about the stigma surrounding PTSD and military service, about the way civilian institutions often fail to understand the value of military medical training. I hid my military service because I was afraid of being judged, afraid of being seen as damaged or difficult, Sarah said. But what I've learned over the past few days is that our stories matter. Our experience matters. The skills we developed in military medicine can save lives in civilian healthcare, but only if we're willing to share them. The speech that Sarah had prepared was supposed to end there. But as she looked out at the audience, she felt compelled to add something more personal. Jessica Thompson was 26 years old when she died, Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. She never got to see her 30th birthday. Never got to have the family she wanted. Never got to use her medical skills to help people in peacetime. But every life I've saved as a civilian nurse, every emergency I've handled, every patient I've comforted, has been possible because of what she taught me about medicine and about service. Sarah paused, looking directly at General Thompson. She taught me that being a medic isn't just about medical knowledge. It's about being willing to stay when others leave, to fight when others give up, to carry the weight of other people's pain so they don't have to carry it alone. The auditorium erupted in applause, but Sarah barely heard it. She was focused on General Thompson, who had tears in his eyes as he stood and saluted her. The simple gesture carried more weight than any medal or commendation could have provided. After the formal presentation, Sarah spent nearly 2 hours talking with individual audience members. Veterans shared their own stories of transition and struggle. Civilian healthcare workers asked questions about military medical training. Family members of fallen soldiers thanked her for honoring their loved one's sacrifice. Dr. Walsh approached her near the end of the evening, his expression thoughtful. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I treated you like a new graduate when I should have been learning from your experience." "You didn't know," Sarah replied. "I made sure you didn't know." "Maybe," Walsh said. "But I should have been more open to the possibility that there was more to your story. I've been thinking about what you said regarding military medical personnel in civilian healthcare. I think we need to do better at recognizing and utilizing those skills." Over the following weeks, Sarah's story continued to resonate beyond the initial presentation. The video of her speech was shared widely on social media, but this time the conversation was different. Instead of speculation and mockery, people were discussing the broader issues she had raised about veteran healthcare workers and the transition from military to civilian medicine. Several major hospitals announced initiatives to better recruit and utilize former military medical personnel. Veterans organizations created programs to help military medics transition to civilian nursing roles. Medical schools began offering credit for military medical training, recognizing that combat experience represented valuable education that shouldn't be dismissed. Sarah returned to work at St. Mary's Hospital, but her role had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just another nurse. She was a resource for other veterans, a mentor for young medical professionals, and an advocate for better utilization of military medical skills in civilian healthcare. Nurse Chen, who had been so concerned about protocol violations, approached Sarah one morning with an unusual request. "We've been contacted by 3 other hospitals in the region," she said. "They want to know if we'd be willing to share our approach to integrating military medical personnel into civilian teams." "What approach?" Sarah asked, confused. "The approach you've been demonstrating," Chen replied. "Recognizing military medical training as valuable experience rather than just alternative education. Using former military medics in leadership roles during emergencies. Creating an environment where veterans feel comfortable sharing their background and skills." Sarah realized that simply by being open about her military service, she had begun to change the culture of the hospital in ways she hadn't anticipated. Other veterans on staff had begun to share their own stories, and civilian personnel had started to appreciate the unique perspectives that military experience brought to healthcare. Dr. Foster, who had inadvertently started the entire chain of events, became one of Sarah's strongest advocates. She wrote an article for a medical journal about the value of military medical training in civilian emergency medicine, using Sarah's story as a case study for how hospitals could better utilize veteran healthcare workers. 6 months after the presentation at Fort Mitchell, Sarah received a phone call that she had been both expecting and dreading. General Thompson was calling to let her know that the Army was planning a formal memorial service for Jessica Thompson, and he wanted Sarah to be part of the ceremony. "It's time," he said simply. "Time to give Jessica the recognition she deserves, and time to officially return her to the family that loved her." The memorial service was held at Arlington National Cemetery on a crisp autumn morning. Sarah stood with General Thompson and his wife, holding Jessica's dog tags for the last time, before placing them in a memorial case that would be displayed at the 3rd Medical Battalion headquarters. As the honor guard folded the flag that had been draped over Jessica's memorial marker, Sarah felt a sense of completion that she hadn't experienced in 5 years. Jessica's story had been told, her sacrifice had been honored, and her memory had been given the dignity it deserved. But more than that, Sarah had finally found a way to transform her grief into purpose. She had stopped hiding from her military service and started using it to serve others. She had learned that honoring the dead sometimes meant living fully as yourself, using all of your skills and experience to make a difference in the world. After the ceremony, General Thompson pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Jessica would be proud of what you've accomplished," he said. "Not just today, but over the past few months. You've taken her story and used it to help other people. She always said that medical training was wasted if you didn't use it to serve others," Sarah replied. "I think she'd be happy to know that her story is helping other veterans find their place in civilian healthcare. I think she'd be happy to know that her friend found her way home," the general said quietly. As Sarah drove back to Colorado that evening, she reflected on how much had changed since that day in the hospital trauma bay when her scrub top had torn and revealed her tattoo. What had started as an accidental exposure of her hidden past had become a deliberate choice to live authentically and serve openly. She was no longer Sarah Martinez, the quiet civilian nurse who avoided questions about her background. She was Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, combat medic, friend of Jessica Thompson, advocate for veteran healthcare workers, and someone who had learned that the best way to honor the fallen was to use their memory as inspiration for serving the living. The following Monday, Sarah returned to work at St. Mary's Hospital, wearing a new name badge that identified her as, quote, Sarah Martinez, RN, former Army combat medic. It was a small change, but it represented a fundamental shift in how she understood herself and her place in the world. During her shift, a young nursing student approached her with obvious nervousness. "Excuse me, Sergeant Martinez? I'm Tyler Brooks. I'm thinking about joining the Army after I finish nursing school, and I was wondering if you could tell me about military medicine." Sarah smiled, remembering Jessica's enthusiasm for teaching and mentoring younger medics. "I'd be happy to," she said. "Let's start with why you're interested in military service." As she began to share her knowledge and experience with the next generation of potential military medics, Sarah realized that Jessica's legacy was continuing to grow. Every person she mentored, every veteran she helped transition to civilian healthcare, every life she saved using skills learned in military service was part of Jessica's ongoing impact on the world. The tattoo on Sarah's shoulder blade was no longer a hidden reminder of loss and guilt. It had become a visible symbol of service, sacrifice, and the enduring bonds between those who served together. And sometimes, when she was working in the trauma bay during a particularly difficult case, Sarah could almost hear Jessica's voice encouraging her to keep fighting, to never give up, to remember that being a medic meant being willing to carry other people's pain so they didn't have to carry it alone. Jessica Thompson had died on a dusty road in Afghanistan, but her spirit lived on in every life that Sarah saved, every veteran she helped, and every person who heard their story and understood what military medical service really meant. And that, Sarah had finally learned, was the truest form of honor she could offer her fallen friend. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.